Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the hidden mechanics of how we share information. We'll be taking a journey from our most intimate, quiet thoughts all the way up to massive global media broadcasts. It's a completely fascinating look at the invisible threads that connect us all.
Today's journey scales outward like a ripple. We'll hit the anatomy of communication, connect across different contexts, break down the barriers that stop us, explore mass media and society, and then wrap it all up with a core summary.
All right, Section 1, the anatomy of communication. Let's look at the absolute fundamental building blocks of how we connect. We tend to think of communication as just talking at someone, but it's never just a static event. It's actually this highly dynamic, continuous loop. In fact, the word itself comes from the Latin root communis, which literally means to make common or to share. So, whenever you're communicating, you're actively in this two-way process of encoding a message, sending it, and having the other person decode it. You're constantly sharing meaning back and forth.
Because this loop is so deeply hardwired into us, it leads to this honestly mind-blowing realization: you cannot not communicate. Seriously. What's so fascinating about this pervasive rule is that everything you do, or even deliberately choose not to do, sends a message to the world around you. Total silence, a blank stare, walking out of a room, all of it means something. And this constant sharing doesn't just happen in one setting, right? It scales outward in expanding ripples. It starts super intimately at the intrapersonal level. That's literally the internal self-talk and cognitive processing happening in your own head right this second. Then it expands to interpersonal, a direct exchange between two people. From there, it ripples out to group communication, where 3 or more people interact with a shared goal. Think of your standard team meeting. And finally, we hit mass communication, where messages are blasted out to huge anonymous audiences.
Moving right along to Section 2, connecting across different contexts. Let's explore how our interactions drastically shift depending on the medium and cultural environment. This perfectly illustrates the two main channels we use in these contexts, verbal and nonverbal. Think about the strict, explicit structure of verbal communication. It's built on vocabulary, rules of grammar, syntax. It's very direct. But then look at the nonverbal side. It's way less structured, totally spontaneous, and largely implicit. We're talking about your body movements, kinetics, your tone of voice, paralanguage, and even how much physical space you take up, known as proxemics. I mean, think about how someone crossing their arms and taking a huge step back reveals exactly how they feel before they've even spoken a single word.
Now, what's really wild is how that verbal and nonverbal split maps onto global cultures. We see a massive contrast here. In low-context cultures, like the US or Germany, people rely heavily on explicit, direct verbal statements. Say what you mean and mean what you say. But in high-context cultures, like Japan or India, the actual words, they're just a tiny piece of the puzzle. They rely deeply on implicit nonverbal cues, situational context, and established relationships to decode the true message.
Because of these profound differences, a major roadblock pops up: ethnocentrism. That's the tendency to judge other cultures strictly by the standards of your own. To successfully navigate our highly connected global world, we absolutely have to drop that judgment. Instead, we need to actively develop our cultural intelligence, or CQ. CQ is essentially your capacity to observe and adapt to distinct cultural norms, so you can actually be understood rather than just being, the loudest person in the room.
So let's see how this builds when we bring a bunch of people together. When individuals join forces for a shared purpose, they don't just instantly succeed. Actually, according to Tuckman's model of group dynamics, they have to evolve through 5 distinct stages. They start with forming, push through the inevitable and sometimes really messy conflict of storming, figure out their rules during norming, finally hit their stride in performing, and then ultimately wrap things up with adjourning. It's a necessary evolution for literally any successful team.
A really specialized example of this is a classroom. A great classroom climate constantly shifts between 2 gears. You have asymmetrical interaction, where the teacher delivers content with authoritative direction, and then you have symmetrical interaction, which relies on peer-driven, balanced discussion. Bouncing between these two actually creates socio-emotional support and lowers cognitive anxiety, which is what allows real learning to happen.
That brings us to Section 3, breaking down the barriers. What happens when these vital communication loops break down or get completely distorted? Let's look at the roadblocks.
This matrix categorizes the chaotic noise that threatens our connections every single day. And these barriers range from basic physical issues, like background noise or geographical distance, to semantic barriers, like complex jargon and ambiguous phrasing that literally get lost in translation. Then we have psychological barriers, things like selective perception, anxiety, and emotional stress. In the workplace, organizational barriers, like an overly rigid hierarchy, can completely block the upward flow of feedback. And finally, sociocultural barriers, like the stereotypes and ethnocentrism we talked about earlier, can stop a message dead in its tracks.
The absolutely crucial point here is that some of these psychological barriers can be utterly disastrous, especially in a group setting. Take groupthink. This happens when the intense desire to maintain group harmony completely overrides critical evaluation. People literally stop raising red flags just because they don't want to rock the boat. This is the exact psychological trap that has led massive corporations to launch disastrous products or completely ignore glaring market shifts. All right, Section 4, Mass Media and Society. For our final expansion of the ripple effect, let's zoom all the way out to the macro level to see how information shapes society at large. When communication scales up to mass media, whether that's television, print, or the digital web, it takes on some massive societal functions. Mass media doesn't just entertain us, it's the primary engine for information dissemination. It acts as a generational socializer, actively shaping our cultural norms and values. Plus, it operates as the fourth estate, a public watchdog, providing surveillance over governmental and institutional power to keep them in check.
With all that unprecedented power over vast, diverse populations, it begs a really important and heavily debated question. Does the media actually tell us what to think?
Well, according to the agenda-setting theory developed by McCombs and Shaw, the answer is technically no. The media doesn't force-feed us exact opinions. However, by selectively prioritizing specific stories and slapping them on the front page or the very top of your feed, the media firmly dictates what we think about. They essentially set the menu of topics that society focuses its collective attention on.
And if we look at George Gerbner's cultivation theory, the plot thickens even more. This theory suggests that long-term exposure to media actually alters how we perceive the reality of the world around us. For example, if you're constantly consuming sensationalized local crime news, you might develop what's called mean world syndrome, perceiving your own neighborhood to be vastly more dangerous than the statistics actually show. The media subtly cultivates your baseline reality.
It creates this really fascinating tug-of-war between two other major theories. On one side, the uses and gratifications theory proves that we aren't just passive zombies. Audiences actively seek out specific media to satisfy their own personal needs for information or entertainment. But simultaneously, framing theory shows that while we're seeking out that media, the media is highlighting specific aspects of a story and omitting others, subtly framing the issue to influence how we interpret the event. It's this constant, dynamic push and pull.
Section 5, the core summary. Let's bring all of these concepts together to clearly review the entire spectrum of our communication journey.
This final matrix acts as a cheat sheet for our entire explainer, linking the different domains of communication we've explored with their primary risks and challenges. At the basic communication process level, the big risk is environmental noise and semantic distortion. With nonverbal cues, the trap is cultural misinterpretation. In the classroom, authoritative barriers can lead to passive listening and cognitive overload, and at the mass media level, the risks scale way up to widespread misinformation, media bias, and getting trapped in echo chambers. Basically, every single level of the ripple effect has its own distinct vulnerabilities. So as you move through your day-to-day, from your private self-talk to navigating office group dynamics, all the way to scrolling through your digital feeds, I want you to ask yourself a question. How much of your reality is truly yours, and how much is being quietly shaped by the medium and the cultural context around you? Keep an eye on those ripples. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to decode the world around us.